to like and subscribe for more videos like this.
Hey everybody. I was reading an article that was produced by Hornby, Hornby, which is a UK-based hobby company that basically was touting the health benefits of model railroading. If you were watching one of my other recent videos that had a bogus, in my opinion, survey about how unattractive model railroading is as a hobby, but it was, I think, baseless. But this is good news. I think in a world post-COVID in particular, mental health is a huge thing. And the study found that 60% of respondents experienced mental well-being, happiness, social connectivity, and an overall sense of well-being from model railroading and similar hobbies. I think this makes sense. In a digital world full of screens, it's sometimes nice to go analog. And it's cool because even if you're using your smartphone or a tablet or another device, you can actually run your trains using it now in a lot of cases with Bluetooth and other things. So you're not totally disconnected, but you can refocus. So let's run some trains, and then to kind of help with calmness and, I guess, mental acuity, I'm going to read from another Gutenberg.org book that covers trains that will hopefully be relaxing to you. And maybe that'll provide some healthful benefits. I'm running one of my favorite engines. It's the C&O Engine 492 Hudson. It is of the Art Deco style. The survivor of this engine is one of its sister engines, Engine 490, which lives on at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. And it is stored indoors. It would be awesome if they ultimately get that thing restored and on the rails. But for now, we'll get this rolling on our rails. And you can just enjoy it, and then I'm just going to let it run. And then I'm going to read in a little bit. So stick around and we'll see that this gets rolling here. Welcome, and here we go again. Another installment of reading a railroad-related book or an excerpt from a book from Gutenberg.org, which is free use reading materials. And in this case, it is a book from 1903 called Careers of Danger and Daring, of which there is a section on railroading. And this excerpt I'm going to read is related to a train run where they broke a speed record. And again, bear in mind, this is the early 1900s, so it's all relative, but it's interesting. So let's kick this thing off. This is called Some Memories of the Great Record-Breaking Run from Chicago to Buffalo. There is a place in New York, the very last one would think of, where stories without end may be heard about locomotives and the men who drive them. It's not a place of grime and steam, but a quiet and luxurious club spread over the top floor of a very tall building on 42nd Street. And here, every day, the luncheon-time railroad officials gather, superintendents, managers, and various heads of departments, men who have grown up prosperously and portly, but are always proud to talk about the boys at the throttle and recall experiences of their own in certain exciting runs. In the wide hall near the entrance of this transportation club is a driving wheel, green painted, from the DeWitt Clinton, the first locomotive that drew a passenger train in the state of New York. It is scarcely larger than a wagon wheel, though made of iron, and an inscription set forth how it made the historic run from Albany to Schenectady on August 9, 1831. The walls show many pictures, famous locomotives, scenes of accidents, and there are thrilling memoirs here in abundance if one have with him some veteran of the road to recall them. It's not always the most serious accidents that frighten a man most, remarked a high official from the New York Central one day while the rest of us listened. One of the worst scares I ever had was on a freight train, when there really wasn't anything to be scared about. We had just pulled out of Ottumwa, Iowa, one dark night, where the caboose full of passengers went rump, ump, bang, rip. You never heard such a racket. First one end of the car was lifted up off the rails and slammed down again, and then the other end was treated the same way. Up and down we went, bump, 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 and smash went the windows, and out went the lights. Now what do you suppose it was? A hog under the wheels, suggested one of the group. More like a mule, said another. There's nothing so tough as the hind leg of a mule. Isn't a car wheel made that'll cut through them? It wasn't a mule or a hog, and it wasn't anything alive, but it got us into a panic all right. We waved a lantern like fury to the engineer ahead, but he didn't see it for a good while, and we just bumped along, expecting every second to be split into kindling wood. We stopped at last and found it was a beer keg. Yes, sir, an empty beer keg that had been caught under the caboose, between the rear axle and the bolster of the truck, and had rolled along over the ties with the car balanced on it like a man riding a wheel. A rail. Wasn't broken either, no, sir, not a bit. We had to chisel through every blamed hoop we could get it out of. Talk about making things strong. That beer keg was a wonder. I had a more exciting experience than that, said another official. He was in the freight handling department. It was a long time ago, yes, back in 63. It's 1863, folks. I remember getting into the train at a station near Cincinnati to look at some soldiers. Before I knew it, the train started. I was up in the engine, and as the drivers began to turn, I jumped on the cowcatcher. You see, I'd often ridden there, being a man of the railroad, and the engineer knew me. Everything went well for a few minutes, and I sat on the bumper enjoying the rush of air, for it was a hot summer's day. But presently, as we swung around a curve, the engine gave a fearful shriek, and just ahead I saw a farmer's wagon crossing the track. There were 2 old men on the seat and an old white horse in the shafts. The men were so busy talking they never heard the whistle, or perhaps they were deaf. Anyhow, we were right on them before they looked up, and they were too dazed to do anything. One of them made a grab for the reins, but it was too late, and I drew my legs up off the bumper and leaned back against the edge of the boiler. I must have made a picture as I crouched there, and the next second, well, said somebody. Well, I guess you wouldn't care to hear how things looked the next second. We struck the white horse just back of his forelegs, and I had him on my lap for 100 yards or so. No, it didn't hurt me, but it wasn't pleasant. The 2 old men, I don't think they felt anything. It was so sudden they just passed out. No, I didn't see them, but I can tell you this, I've never ridden on the cowcatcher of a locomotive since that day. There followed some talk about fast runs, and all agreed that for out-and-out excitement, there's nothing in railroading to equal a man's sensations in one of those mad bursts of speed that are ventured upon now and then by locomotives in record-breaking trials. The heart pounds with apprehension in a real accident as it does through imminent fear of an accident. And so great is the nerve and the brain strain upon the men who drive our ordinary flyers, that 3 hours at a stretch is as much as the staunchest engineer can endure running at 50 or 60 miles an hour. So you see, said one of the officials, the problem of higher speeds that we have at present involves more than boiler power and strength of machinery and the swiftness of turning wheels. It involves the question of human endurance. We can build engines that will run 150 miles an hour, but where shall we find the men to drive them? Already we have nearly reached the limit of what eyes and nerves can handle. I guess we'll have to find a new race of men to handle these locomotives of the future that they talk so much about. He went on to consider the chance of color blindness in an engineer, and told the men's eyes are given regular tests by experts who put before them skeins of various yarns and make them pick out green from red and so on. It's not a pleasant thing to think what might happen if an engineer's eye should suddenly fail him, and he should mistake the dark light for safety and go ahead at some critical moment instead of stopping. Nor does one like the fancy of what might happen if an engineer should go mad at his post. I know one case where an engineer did go mad, remarked the superintendent. He was one of the most experienced men and had held the throttle for years of the fastest locomotives. Then one Sunday, for no reason at all, he went to the roundhouse and got out the pony locomotive. That's the one fixed with a little parlor over the boiler, and easy chairs and polished wood. It makes a pretty observation car for big officials. Well, he got out there and started lickety-split up the main line, running wild and without orders. He stopped at Mott Haven and told the men he wanted the pony rebuilt and silver-plated. Crazy as a loon, you see. Yes, he's in the asylum now, poor fellow, and that was his last run. After this, one of the group gave his memories from the famous speed trial of the Lake Shore Road, where 5 locomotives and relays, driven by picked men, set out to beat all records in a run of 510 miles from Chicago to Buffalo. This was in October 1895, and I suppose such elaborate preparations for a dash over the rails were never made. All traffic was suspended for the passage of this racing special. Every railroad crossing between Chicago and Buffalo was patrolled by a section man. That alone meant 1,300 guards, and every switch was spiked half an hour before the train was due. The chief officials of the Lakeshore Road proposed to ride this race in person and, if possible, smash the New York Central's then record, which was 63.61 miles an hour, including all stops over the 436.5 miles between New York and Buffalo. They had before them a longer run than that, and hoped to score a greater average speed per mile, but they wished to come through alive and were taking no chances. It was 3:30 in the morning in frosty weather when the train started from Chicago with Mark Floyd at the throttle and various important people, general managers, superintendents, editors, etc., on the cars behind. There were 2 parlor coaches weighing 92,500 pounds each, and a millionaire's private car, one of the finest and heaviest in the country, weighing 119,500 pounds, which made a total, counting engine and train, of something over 200 tons. The first relay was 87 miles to Elkhart, Indiana, and the second they hoped to follow required that they covered this distance in 78 minutes, including 9 slowdowns. 87 miles in 78 minutes was well enough, but the superintendent of the Western Division had set his heart on doing it in 75 minutes, and had promised Mark Floyd 200 good cigars for every quarter of a minute he could cut under the time. But alas for human plans! Between upgrades and the darkness, they pulled into Elkhart at 5 minutes to 5, which was 85 minutes for the 87 miles. Not bad going, but it left them 7 minutes behind the schedule, enough Mark to console himself with his old clay pipe. 131 seconds were lost at Elkhart in changing locomotives, and it was 3 minutes to 5 when Big 599, with Dave loose in the cab, turned toward the dawning day and started for Toledo, 133 miles away. Great things were expected in this relay, for about half of it was straight as a bird's flight and downgrade too, so hopes were high of making up lost time, especially as Luce had the reputation of stopping at nothing when it was a question of getting there. He certainly did wonders, and 5 minutes after the start, he had the train at 62-mile gait, and 10 minutes later at a 67-mile gait. Then they struck frost on the rails and the speed dropped, while the time-takers studied their stopwatches with serious faces. At 10 minutes to 6, they reached Waterloo and the long, straight stretch. As they whizzed past the station, Dave pulled open his throttle to the last notch and yelled to his firemen. Here was where they had to do things. Butler was 7.5 miles away, the first town in the downgrade, and they made it in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, nearly 68 miles an hour. In the next 7 miles, Dave pushed her up to 70 miles an hour, then 72.5, and let her out in great bursts, which made the passengers sit up, and showed for several miles a top-notch rate of 87 miles an hour. Nevertheless, taking account of frost and slowdowns, they barely finished the relay on scheduled time, so the whole run they were still 7 minutes behind time. The schedule they had set for themselves called for such tremendous speed that it seemed almost impossible to make up a single lost minute. The third relay was 108 miles to Cleveland, and they did it in 104 minutes, including many slowdowns and a heartbreaking loss of 4 minutes, when a section hand red-flagged the train and brought it to a dead stop from a 70-mile gate because it had found a broken rail. The officials were in such a state of tension that they would almost have preferred chancing it on the rail to losing these 4 minutes. There's a point of eagerness in railroad racing when it seems nothing to risk one's life. The train drew out of Cleveland 19 minutes behind the time they should have made it for the world's record. Every man had done his best, every locomotive had worked its hardest, but fate seemed against them, and hopes of beating the Central's fast run were fading rapidly. The fourth relay was eerie, 95.5 miles, and some said that Jack Gardner with 598 might pull them out of the hole, but others shook their head. At any rate, Jack did better than those who'd preceded him, and he danced the train along at 75, 80, 84 miles an hour, so the watches said, and an average 67 miles an hour for the whole relay. It's the kind of thing that makes you taste your heart and pack a week into 10 minutes, said the superintendent, telling about it. You may take one ride smashing around curves at 80 miles an hour, but you'll never take another. Still, in spite of these brave efforts, they pulled out of Erie 15 minutes late and started over the last relay with gloomy faces. It was 86 miles to Buffalo, the end of the race, and they must still be there by 11:31 to win, which called for an average speed of over 70 miles an hour, including slowdowns. No train in the world had ever approached such an average, and their only racing average since leaving Chicago was much below it. So was there hope? There was hope in a tall, sparely built man named Bill Tunkey, whom nobody knew so much about except that he was a good engineer with a rather clumsy 10-wheel locomotive not considered very desirable in a race. All the other locomotives had been 8-wheelers. Still, the new engine had one advantage. She carried water enough in her tank for the whole run and need not slow down to refill, as others had done. She had another advantage. She carried Tunkey, one of the men who rise up in sudden emergencies and do things, whether they are possible or not. If it was not possible, everyone vowed, to reach Buffalo Creek by 11:31. But Tunkey felt differently. All right, said Tunkey quietly, and then, within 40 rods of the start, he had his engine going 30 miles an hour, and he pushed her harder and harder until 11 miles out of Erie, she struck 80 miles at a pace and held it as far as Brockton, where she put forth all her strength and did a burst of 5 miles in 3.5 minutes. One of these miles at the rate of 92.5 miles an hour, as the watches showed. And I never want any more of that in mind, said the superintendent. The next town was Dunkirk, where a local ordinance put a 10-mile limit on the speed of trains. Tunkey smiled as they roared past the station at more than 80. A crowd lined the tracks here, for the telegraph had carried about the news of a hair-raising run. The crowd was only a blur of staring, frightened eyes at the car windows. The officials were beginning to realize what kind of an engineer they had ahead this time. Whiz! How they did run! War! Barked little bridges and were left behind. Whoo! Bellowed a tunnel, and rip-whir! As they slammed around a double reverse curve with a vicious swing that made the bolts rattle in the last car. Men put their mouths to other men's ears and tried to say perhaps Mr. Tunkey was getting a little overzealous. Much good that did. Mr. Tunkey had bitten his teeth, and now he's playing the game alone. At 11:06, they had swept past Silver Creek with 29 miles to go and 25 miles to make it. Hurrah! They had made up time enough to save them. At 11:20, they passed Lakeview. 12 minutes more in 11 minutes, yelled somebody, waving his hat. Toboggan slide all the way, yelled somebody else. We'll do it easy, hooray. They passed Atoll Springs at 11:24, all mad with excitement. They had 7 minutes left for an 8-mile journey, and they were cheering already. We made it with half a minute to spare, and the only man in the private car who was reasonably cool. He was 6 seconds out of the way, for they crossed the line 26 seconds before 11:31 and won the race by less than half a minute, beating the New York Central's record per mile on the whole run by the fraction of a second, and beating the whole world's record in the last relay by several minutes. The figures standing, Tunkey's figures, 86 miles from Erie to Buffalo in 70 minutes and 46 seconds, or an average speed of 72.91 miles per hour. Do, said the official. What did we do? Why, we. He paused helplessly and then added with a grin, well, we didn't do a thing to Tunkey. And that concludes this thrilling railroad-related reading. Hopefully you found it relaxing and enjoyable. And thank you, as always, for tuning in.